What Remains of Edith Finch is a heart-wrenching tale of a family who seems to be unable to escape death. At the center of the tragedy, we see the grandmother Edie, who has lived through every mother's greatest fear of outliving their children, and in this case even grandchildren. In this video, I'll attempt to rank each Finch's death based on the presentation as well as its emotional impact. So like how it's represented in their stories and overall just the impact on me. Last, overall, 14th, I have Odin Finch's death. Odin's death was probably the least impactful overall in the story, as we really didn't get to see shit about it. It's literally just a slideshow, click, click, click. And overall, you can tell the writers didn't really want to put emphasis on it because it was beyond Edith, and like the only one who really could acknowledge it was Edie. Next, at 13th, I have Sven Finch. While the death of Sven is rather tragic, Edie keeps this like tongue-in-cheek, saying he was killed by a dragon, right, playing it off of humor, which in my opinion, I think that's just her coping with it, as I know people will use humor sometimes to cope with death, because overall, who really wants to carry that weight? And a little bit of humor can be used as a distraction in that case. But honestly, bro, if you're on your Matt Pat like nerd shit, then you can view Edie as being a serial killer, and like she photographed her husband, which I think the photograph there does make it a little more tragic, but yeah, there's not much emphasis on that one, and that's why I have it so low. Next, 12th, believe it or not, I have Milton, not including the game The Unfinished Swan, but I feel we're given a lot of information throughout the house, as the house is blotched in his paint, but since he was close to Edith, right, that's why we get a little bit of emphasis on him. He's the protagonist brother, but there's a personal connection and understanding of the behavior with Milton built there. But while I really like the flip book, like the stop motion little book, it's cool, and I think it's rather fitting. There's a lot of ambiguity, and the ambiguity doesn't really help invoke any kind of emotional response. While the presentation is nice, there's not much given here. Alright, at 11th overall, well, I think is probably one of the most compelling characters in the book, Dawn Finch, as she's expanded throughout the story, as she's the mother of Edith, our main character, or at least our eyes through the majority of the story. We see all that she has lived through, and you kind of begin to understand like why she is that way, right? Like why she's controlling when everyone around her is dying. It's pretty understandable, and why she wants to get away with it. Arguably the most relatable character in the book, but her death is rather like kind of normal. It's just presented through her arm caressing Edith, and then she died. I feel like this death is, I don't know, has a lot less of an emotional impact, but the lack of ambiguity and creativity there too robs it of the beauty that we see in some of the other ones. As well as like I kind of found they bunched up a bunch of deaths. There's like a sequence of 3 rapid deaths there with Edith, Edie, and Dawn. Next, Edie, the oldest Finch, who lived to see all of her children die, is probably the most tragic in the story. If you don't view her as a killer, like some cornballs, of course, fucking Matt Pat. Edie got to see her children, husband and grandfather, all die in front of her eyes, right? Which is probably the worst thing there, and like it becomes understandable when followed by all that tragedy on why she uses like the stories as a mechanism to death. It's better to not really see those people as humans in that case. It's a rather sad tale. And while the partial story of seeing the old house is okay, I find like the ambiguity does help it there, as we don't really know too much what happened. I don't believe her death is really fleshed out enough though there, as we don't really get to see anything. We just know she was old and she died. I really wasn't sure about that one. One of the more realistic ones next. In 9th, I have Gus's death, in my opinion, is probably one of the more realistic tales, and that's where it gets a lot of its value. It's being told through a poem in which Dawn wrote, which is fucking heart-wrenching, but Gus is presented as like an angry outcast kid. We literally see as a mohawk. He's on his JT shit, and he wasn't happy with his father remarrying, right? And the presentation with the kite and the wedding, and as you see everyone else around you slowly disappear as the weather gets darker, as well as your mood, as your dad yells at you, you start to present a darker mood overall, and like it's a pathetic fallacy, and it really is beautiful there. And more so just the kid being angry about his parents being divorced. and refusing to listen to the point where he dies, right, is a lot more real to it, adds the aspect of realism. And then I'll play a clip here. Don's words are probably what make it the best, though, or what make it its strongest.
I wish that I could truly say I thought about you on that day. Out there on the beach alone, just you, the wind, the sea, and foam. But I didn't, until we found you.
Number 8 overall, I have Calvin's death. I was debating between this one and Barbra, but overall I found the presentation on Barbara's was outstanding, and the background knowledge that we're given within the house expands on it a bit more, which I would put it over. However, in Calvin's case, the letter written about Calvin and the presentation of his delusion is kind of heart-wrenching. I mean, overall, Calvin was just a boy, right? He had a dream, he wanted to fly. It wasn't a case of trauma or anything negative. It was just he had a dream and it didn't work out for him. He delusionally had his mindset and probably died an extremely painful death because of it when you think of it, falling off a cliff. Doesn't sound too good to me. Next up, as I previously mentioned, Barbra's death is probably the most ambiguous one there, but the way it's presented is probably the coolest and most abstract way you'll see as it's through the comic, and we have the jack-o'-lantern dude narrating her death. To add a bit of emotional value, we can see how Edie instantly turned to monetizing or publicizing the death for the forms of a comic book, which is pretty sad, as that's kind of all Barbra was, right? As a child actor forced into the spotlight early on. More so, the crutch in the basement also shows the validity of this representation, as we see he holds on to the crutch as a weapon, and we used it as a weapon in Walter's case. Barbra was very well murdered there, and this death also seems to be very real despite being pictured in one of the most abstract ways, a cartoonish way, but what's so real about it is actors, or just famous people in general, often do encounter stalkers and crazy fans. It's likely a group of them killed her to see how she would act in a horror movie state, which is kind of what they present there. They wanted to see her scream. Overall, Barbra's death is also expanded on with the posters and memorabilia with the posters and memorabilia throughout the house. Sam Finch is my next one at 6 overall. Sam was Don's father and spent a long time in the military, arguably isolating himself after his twin brother's death, or at the very least trying to escape that. The death itself is presented through photos of a hunting trip with Don, which I do really think is a cool aspect there. As you're taking the photos, the story goes on, and in the final moments we see a time shot kind of similar to Sven's death. I think the real value in this death, though, is not really through Sam's, but through the irony and Don's presence there, as he was trying to teach Don that you're gonna have to be strong to survive in this world, but you reap what you sow type shit. He died because of that lack of strength, and because of that lack of strength that he's trying to give Don. I probably surprisingly high up, but at number 5 overall, I have Molly Finch. I'm putting it more because of the context rather than emotional value, although the presentation was amazing last one. It's basically a story of a little girl being locked into her room where she was so hungry that she starts eating like hamster food, or even like hamster droppings potentially, which could give you salmonella, toothpaste, and the berries off of fucking mistletoe. It's a brutal concept to think of a kid being put in that situation where they kind of just kill themselves because how hungry they are. And I think the presentation is probably the best part of this, though, as she's presented as hungry animals. First a cat chasing the bird, then an owl, then a shark, then a monster, eventually eating herself, kind of symbolizing that the hunger completely consumed her. Poor girl. Hee hee.
Finch. Finch left alive.
Okay, at number 4, I have Edith. It's hard not to put Edith's deaths high up because the presentation is wonderful as it comes as he almost faded to black after her mother's death, as well as Edith is our main character in the story who we've lived through everything with, so it's hard to not have a bit of an emotional attachment there too. As well as there's a bit of foreshadowing as you go through the tunnel and you can see the light paralleled with the powerful words to her future child.
And appreciate how strange and brief all of this is. This journal was supposed to
Like
be
in the
for
end
you.
here, I actually end up screaming like, holy fuck, we're coming out of her vagina. The symbolism of new life being born and the way it's presented is
I just
awesome.
want to meet.
At number 3, I have Gregory. It's short, as he was a baby. There's not much dialogue, but the real tragedy was the neglection in this one. As Sam and his wife attempt to negate what really happened, they say they wish they could see the world through the child's eyes and keep preaching on how imaginative the kid is. But in reality, what happened is a child just like hopelessly struggled in a bathtub, and as he made cries for help, no one answered, and then he cried until he couldn't. It's probably a really sad thing to think of. And the presentation on this one is very, very nice though, and they do make it beautiful as the baby starts swimming in the water, as it goes from playing with the toys until when he actually starts to die, then we're swimming in the water with them. Alright, Lewis was portrayed as the biggest outcast in the family, have him as number 2 overall. He was shown as a stoner and kinda ostracized by the family. We saw him wearing a baseball jersey, but I'm not sure if he actually ever got to experience that. Lewis had to deal with the death of his family members just as anyone else would in the family, but he didn't have an outlet like the others to take it out like Milton had painting. He was kind of forced into a job, and as a kid he lost touch with everything. He just kind of wanted to escape, and Lewis escaped so far in his mind that he became a robot on the inside. He became a shell of himself, and his imagination became his true character. I really like how this was narrated by a psychiatrist, and we kind of get to see Lewis fade away. While we could write him off as delusional, ultimately he wouldn't want to be delusional put in that spot, as his imagination was as real as his body. The death itself was the second most emotionally impactful for me, but the presentation is perfect. The slowly fading from the cannery job into Lewis's mind, watching the world in his head grow as the real world faded away. All the imagery and symbolism with the fish and the final like guillotine crown, oh my. Number 1, first and foremost, probably the best for me, was Walter. Walter was shown cowarding away in Barbra's story, and it's a real representation of how I feel a lot of people would deal with that trauma. After seeing his sister murdered, Walter, instead of confronting the world, he cowards away and allows his body to rot away with his mind. I mean, Walter becomes a mole man, stuck in the same routine for so long that like time doesn't even become existent for him until you notice the change in the routine, right? The monster stops making a noise, and Walter finally breaks the chain. He tries to break out, and I'll just let it speak for itself.
And Molly. And Calvin. Maybe this is all a mistake. But I need to stop living the same day, even if it kills me. Whatever's out there, I want you to know I'm ready for it. I'm going to appreciate all of it, especially the food. I don't mind if I only have a year left, or a month, or a single week. I'd be happy.
Yeah, he ends up getting hit by a fucking train.
I can already imagine.
Overall, putting numbers on these is kind of stupid. I get that. It's kind of fucking dumb, because each death has its own emotional impact depending on the proximity to like your experience, right? There's no real way to order this. The sealed rooms after the death to remind the family of the dead family members is a rather brutal reminder that we see throughout the game, and overall, it's a beautiful game. I would recommend it.